Okay, welcome everybody to the session where it's being co-chaired by Bex here from Advocate, myself. My name is Chili Reid from Advice UK. You're very welcome. As we said, there's more people due and they may come in, but it's, as they say, quality, not quantity. The aim of the session, I mean, first of all, if you're not close to the advice sector, you won't have the details. This is about the advice sector, by the way. And people who would use the advice sector or go to the advice sector. If you're not close to the advice sector, you won't have all the metrics necessarily that show how challenging, to use a euphemism, it is out there, both for people who are seeking advice or not getting advice, and also the provision of advice and all issues around that. So we're going to focus on this in the session, not just on, we're not going to paint the cost of living picture because most people know what is going on, have a sense of it. We're looking at more at solutions and actions that we can take individually or collectively. So we want the focus to be on advice services generally, advisors and well-being of advisors actually, and some on the people. But we also are looking for new ideas, not painting the same old pictures if we can, encouraging you to think in sort of outside of your proverbial box, to think about your organisational remit, what your organisation might be able to do in a direct or indirect way. And we recognise, as ever with these conferences, there's a dearth of actual advisors in the conference. So it's lots of people talking about other people's work, and then their work is vicarious too. So we recognise that. So if you are from an advice centre and deliver so-called frontline advice, then please make yourself known. And if you're not, if you're coming from a funder perspective, academic perspective, government department perspective, levelling up, whatever, lawyer, just think about what you can and can't do and bring it in and share it, because there's some very intelligent people in this room. The only metric I'm going to give you actually is a metric that comes from Citizens Advice and Advice UK around debt work. So the term deficit budgets, it means in old language that people can't make ends meet. So between those two organisations, which is about 90% of the debt advice field, in October 2021, 17% of people seeking debt advice had so-called deficit budgets, which means they didn't have money to pay what is due when it's due. That figure in October this year was 44%. So nearly half the people presenting themselves for advice aren't able to pay what is due now. And this, of course, is in October. So who knows what will happen with a cold-ish winter. And there's all sorts of other metrics like the Trust Food Bank said there's 320,000 new people in the last quarter of their measuring. So it's incredibly real out there. And yesterday inflation hit 11.1% and we had a budget which put benefits at least back in check with inflation and triple locked the pensions. But the amazing amount of pressure still on the people, the organisations and society in general and the advisors. So yesterday, I guess in this room, looking around, there may be people that are more concerned about the 45p actually going down, but actually working at the other end of the spectrum. So, yeah, I think that's about it, isn't it? An example, by the way, just if it's OK to give an example, yesterday I was at a Traveller Movement conference. Travellers make 7 organisations in our membership. And there was a practical solution given on the day that will take place within a week, which was that travellers on sites in Hertfordshire, there are 11 sites, are unable to, they don't have a direct relationship with the energy companies because they pay the local authority, it was the landlord of the site, which means they can't get the rebate. In fact, they can't get very much in terms of the government schemes because they're not direct consumers. So yesterday, a decision was made to go to the LGA, and they were agreed to go to other local authorities who have changed it to allow people to have direct relationships. The energy companies discriminate against them, so they've got to also work on them. But we've got a week, giving ourselves a week to try and activate that before the cold weather comes. That's an example of people meeting and not just talking theoretically or ethereal, but doing something to counter the cost of living crisis. That is the end of my little speech. Thank you very much. So really, don't be vexed, but push it out. And don't be frightened. There's no right or wrong. Be as creative, be as whatever as possible, but don't just think, oh, there's nothing I can do, because we can all do something in our different ways. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name's Charlotte Bryce. I'm an employment solicitor at Hammersmith and Fulham Law Centre. This is actually a question for everyone because I would like ideas. We're talking a lot today about technology, and the advice sector world is so behind in terms of technology. You know, law centres barely have a functioning case management system, and our clients often don't have internet access or a computer. So, for example, in thinking about how if I launch a pro bono clinic, which I'm planning on doing, I need to ensure that we have physical offices open so people can come in and use our computers. This, you know, it's a real challenge. We can't think about things in an innovative way if we don't have basic technology and access to the internet. So that wasn't really a question. My question is, does anyone have any experience or any ideas for how to help people who don't have the basic access to the computers, potentially might have a smartphone, but often don't have access to Wi-Fi at home, and there's limited provisions in places like local libraries where there's also no confidential spaces often. So yes, question for everyone, because I really would like to hear ideas. Thank you.
Sorry, I used to work predominantly in digital inclusion and I work for HMCTS. There are two options available to you in this country, and one is the Good Things Foundation and the other one is WAD, which are behind us. So I can actually hand across to the WAD at the moment, which are We Are Digital, but the other organisation is that runs the UK Online Centres, which is Good Things Foundation. Have you heard of them? Okay, and this is WAD.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, from We Are Digital, we do a lot of digital exclusion support in the community. So exactly what you just referred to. It is a big problem. We say the three pillars of digital inclusion are skills, internet access and equipment. And a lot of programs do one or a couple, but rarely all three. So as has been mentioned, yeah, Good Things, good partner of ours, run lots of schemes on this up and down the country. Just one, if it's of interest, that we run that would help solve some of the things you just mentioned, is through a Lloyds Bank partnership, where they fund for digitally excluded people. They don't have to be Lloyds Bank customers. 6 hours of free remote digital skills tuition, a free tablet, computer, and through the Vodafone Foundation, a prepaid SIM card that's good for sort of 3 to 4 months of data. And all of that comes as a package. We run that program with Lloyds Bank, sort of for vulnerable people across the UK. So I think, you know, there's not enough of this obviously going on, which I think is your point, but there are quite a few schemes that can help.
Sorry, just to add to that, Good Things Foundation have just basically launched another scheme where communities can apply for 4K to basically help digitally excluded communities, but it's just 4K. You need to look online for that.
I think it's also interesting seeing the kind of additional challenges that go with it. So I'm from Advocate with the Bars Pro Bono charity, and I joined 2 years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, and we used to be entirely paper-based. And we decided actually with the pandemic, because people were in lockdown, to try and make sure we're still accessible for people who couldn't get to their local advice agency, many of which had to close their doors because of lockdown. That meant that we said to people, actually, you can all apply to us remotely. So in terms of accessibility on one level, it was far better. But the challenge we now have is actually trying to manage, one, kind of the emotional needs which people rightly have, secondly, their legal needs, and also the digital needs. So it's our casework team now trying to explain things like how to click on a link or how to make an attachment. So I think coupled with accessibility has come for us a lot more in terms of trying to help with that digital skills, which is not our skill set at all. So great to hear about other ways we can kind of try and help encourage people to be more comfortable with digitization. At the same time, often people aren't interested in that. Actually, they just want to get their legal problem resolved, and actually trying to work out how to click on the link and upload documents is just kind of close to the final straw. So Toby.
I can give a couple of examples which might help with your question as to how to set up a pro bono clinic at an advice centre. So a couple of examples I learnt about this year, one of which was at a law centre where they would invite the clients to come into the law centre to have a remote session with the lawyer who sat at their desk in their office or at home. So the client comes into the law centre, they are greeted by the usual receptionist, they have support from the staff or the volunteer at the law centre to help them dealing with the computer, to get their papers together, to work out what their issues are. But then they can then get remote advice from a lawyer who's on the other end of the computer that's in the law centre. So the lawyer can provide pro bono help from the convenience of their office or from home, which solves some of the issues with trying to get volunteers out in person at the clinic. And so that helps with the digital exclusion that you've got of so many people who don't know how to use a computer or how to use online resources. A second example I learned about this year was the Cardiff Lawyers Care Project, which some of you may know about. I think it won the LawWorks Pro Bono Award one year, and they help homeless people in the Cardiff area. And how it works is they partner with, I think, is it the Wallage, the homelessness charity in Cardiff, who issues a mobile phone to all of their clients, and then so the client then can have a phone conversation with a pro bono lawyer, but a quite sort of clever scheme in which the homeless person has the telephone consultation through the mobile phone the Wallage gives them, but then they have a Teams or a Zoom call at the same time. So the person from the homelessness charity who deals on a day-to-day basis with the client is there on the Zoom call. The pro bono lawyer is there on the Zoom call too. They can all see each other, which obviously helps with making the call easier, but the homeless person doesn't have to be on video, they can just be on phone. So a couple of examples I learned about this year of trying to get over the digital exclusion problem.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just another idea. So I just spoke about the Clock project where we train law students, and they're based at the court desk. So when litigants in person come into the court, then they can actually be with a law student and go through the details. So the law student will have a laptop on the desk, and then the litigant in person can go through. But I think there's an issue there about having to come into court, because essentially we're looking at pre-court. So we're also working with the YMCA, and the YMCA also have linked up with the Vodafone scheme to provide mobile phones, and to be able to provide sort of advice with the Citizens Advice Bureau as well, on welfare. So there's some ideas.
And one of the issues which seems to come up as well, just because of kind of this issue as ever about just demand far outstripping supply for advice services. A few weeks ago, I met with one of the law schools who was saying, as ever, we've got loads of law students who are looking for opportunities, particularly they're saying kind of practical, to kind of developing practical skills, saying kind of telephoning clients, actually just having that experience of making those calls, which perhaps they're not otherwise doing. And they were just saying, we've got loads of students ready to go. My concern always is that on one hand, that sounds fantastic if you can utilise them, but it's really hard to find a really good volunteering opportunity that isn't too resource intensive for the advice agency, that can simply kind of make use of a potential resource there. Just wondered if anyone has any ideas or seen anything recently around good ways of using law students.
Well, we've got some law students with us at the moment, so we have only two, and each one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm Ellen Taylor from Derbyshire Law Centre. So we've got two, so only two, and they're here for the whole academic year. So they come one day a week, each of them, for the whole academic year, and they have a project to do as well, based on what they learn. But that means that we can embed them in our team and use them more as volunteers, because we can train them, and we have time to spend with them, which will actually, we hope, reap some rewards. Whereas I think if people just come for a very short period of time, they're here, you have to think of work for them to do that week or for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they're gone, and they haven't really had time to learn anything. So we're hoping that this model will it'll be a better quality experience for them, and we will also have some benefit, because they will actually be able to learn some skills and do some work for us. So, but we'll watch this space. We'll let you know.
So there are two parts to just go back to your original question. There are two parts, because first of all, you said the advice sector seems to be about 30 years behind everywhere else, commercial sector, I'm sure you mean. And you mentioned things like case management and people using paper. Well, I think 35 law centres, as far as I know, have got Advice Pro, so there's a common case management system going on. Yeah. Right.
I'm loud anyway. I know we have Advice Pro. I do use Advice Pro, but I've got colleagues who are still working on paper, and I just think we just need to bear in mind when we're having all these talks, people even talking about the metaverse and all these things, that we're in different worlds. That was the point I was just trying to create, just trying to think actually in reality we can't innovate yet, we've not even caught up, or maybe we do need to innovate, but we just need to take into account that the advice sector is very much behind.
I think it's recognised, and I think as well the advice sector is bigger than just obviously pro bono conversations, but obviously Lindsay will know this and I know this, that the workforce, the long-term workforce is of the advice sector is a generic thing, is a big issue, isn't it? A massive challenge, and yes, law student placement schemes which we've ran as well are brilliant in their own, but actually there's a sort of career or non-career minded, much larger number of people that we need to sort of think about. In terms of digitisation, it's a simplistic generalisation, but as reams of newer people come in, they're much more digitally with it, if you want to use that expression, than the people who run, who are largely directors or CEOs. It's an age, a demographic thing, and that isn't wonderful now, but it will take over in the same way. I mean, in the same way the other thing was about people who are not skilled, you said, not skilled or don't have access. In a country that still doesn't full broadband, there's some sort of bigger sort of infrastructural issues that we can't necessarily address. But yesterday I was told I'd had this conversation at this traveller movement conference. They were saying the two travellers that I was sitting talking to afterwards, both were on their smartphones, both showing me an app they use around energy, all this stuff. So really savvy, but they were saying that we can't, the energy rebate forms, for example, from government are 100% digital this time. There's no paper-based thing they're saying, which means that I can't fill they were saying if I could do it, which I can't because I haven't got a contract, I can't do it on a smartphone. It's not about the skills, it's just the reality of however wonderful we are with smartphones, I can't do it. So it's some very structural and systemic things as well. I mean, we haven't got an answer, but your question elicits some response which you're getting today, and I think it is one of the biggest challenges. But to be digital and not have the legal response, which is a big issue we had with We Are Digital in the course of the HMCTS contract, is people want they're there initially because they want a legal response, but they can't do it or get it because of their own lack of digitisation or in the case you just mentioned, organisations that haven't quite got themselves digitised. By the way, you're in a law centre. I work for Advice UK. We've got 50+ lawyer employee organisations. Money is all we're talking about. Fancy systems that are in the private sector. Even Advice Pro is challenging for people to buy. So there's got to be a reality check as well in terms of resources. But I agree, we haven't fully embraced on with the best of technology.
Did anyone else have any? Oh, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mary. I'm here as a member of the Civil Justice Council, but I'm mindful I've been coming to these conferences for 10 years. And during that time, I've been wearing lots of different hats, including as a trustee board, member of Support Through Court, as chair of the Legal Services Consumer Panel. So I think I'm kind of pretty user focused in all of this. And my question is, and forgive me because this will sound a really obvious question, but I'd be really interested in hearing maybe from Chile and Bex first and then kind of opening things up, is that if you listen to what everyone is saying in this room, the pockets of excellence are extraordinary. And it's extraordinary what people are doing, and Chile, what you were talking about yesterday in terms of the Travellers Conference. But how do we move from those pockets of excellence into something that feels more holistic and joined up? And I know that's a really obvious question to ask. But actually what I've been hearing in all of those 10 years is there's no doubt that the sector is delivering amazing things for amazing groups of clients, but they're very specific groups of clients in specific parts of the country, etc. How do we turn that into something that's more holistic and more joined up and consistently rolled out? And I know that's going to come down to resources as well, but I just feel as though it's a slight elephant in the room, isn't it? Because actually we talk about the value of networking and collaborating and hearing from each other at these events. But the risk is, I mean, I was saying to Jane, you know, we've been talking to each other at these events probably for 10 years, and we've been hearing not dissimilar kind of points that we've been making. So it's an obvious point, but I do think it's one that we need to address head on.
When you say holistic, what do you mean by holistic?
Well, I suppose it's moving from something that feels a little bit kind of arbitrary to the extent of, you know, you're lucky if you've got a law centre in your area who will do that. You're lucky if that alignment takes place between that organisation and the local university, if there is one in your area, and you're lucky if law students are involved on a pro bono basis. So how do you take that and all those examples which are happening and turn it into something that, if you were then focusing on the user and looking at their journey, how could you guarantee that all users would have access to it? And I suppose that's what I mean by holistic chilling.
Okay. Well, it's I'll speak from an Advice UK perspective if I can. So just so you understand, or people understand, we are 715 member organisations across GB, and 50 plus of those employ lawyers. So there's more specialist organisations in our membership than there are law centres. Very niche, often working with children, like Just for Kids Law, for example, Disability Law Service, disabled people, or even more niche, IPSI, which is an independent education legal provider that nationally works with excluded children specifically. So some very niche. But the vast majority still work with what I call the unholy trinity, which is the housing, welfare benefits and debt. And this is a massive issue. It's an issue for us because we don't, what you call holistic, we call a whole person approach or a whole community approach. And we were funded for years by the Bearing Foundation when Matthew Smurden was there to get to understand far more about people's journeys into advice. And we call it a whole person because one of the most dangerous things, I think, is to separate advice off from other parts of people's lives. It just doesn't work like that. And it's one that where the paucity of funding is where people haven't tried to link it, embed it with other things like health, housing, education, skills, for example. And there are local successes. So Centre England Law Centre, which ran by Sue Bent, who is now retired, was a great example of essentially building relationships on behalf of the client around funding, but also around actually we can almost just about we can follow somebody on their trail, if you like. So the building of those relationships goes beyond the advice, has to go beyond the advice sector. And you'll see examples, of people in this room will know of examples where, at least in terms of advice, local provision as being reasonably joined up in spite of the funding thing, but largely dependent on characters who are essentially really good at building relationships and really good at influencing. And those same people who are good at influencing tend to influence funders and the key stakeholders. So you get, and unfortunately, that means it's quite highly personalised. And so if somebody goes, the whole thing can just collapse. So it's still pockets. But it's that. I haven't got the solution, but I'm just thinking out loud about this. So we have spent a lot of time as a network investing in our own resources to better support, to better link up. So at the moment, for example, we've got a relationship with Trussell Trust, the food bank network, where food banks are linked with us. Some of them become advice centres themselves. We've also developed links with some employers in certain areas where it's outside the advice thing. They're not members of ours, they're associate members. So we're trying to bring together the sort of key things in people's lives that mean actually they may not need to get advice or to be an earlier intervention. And I think the focus shouldn't always be on specialist legal advice. This room may have people in it that's their area of work, but actually 90%, 95% of advice is not legal advice. And if we focus only on that legal advice and say, look, you just have a law centre, there may be, or Advice UK member that's a specialist, or it's advice that as a lawyer, that's part of it. But actually, we need to also focus on the vast majority of so-called bread and butter advice provision, which is not, thankfully, doesn't go up the sort of pathway to need a legal redress. So we are trying to do some of that. I think the resources thing does get in the way, but again, there's lots of support that we can do as well. And one of the biggest areas of support, which Lindsay Pools here would know about as well, because we work together on it, is back to the workforce. Because as we give more support to workforce development and workforce security and better mental and physical health, which we can do to a certain degree, those more robust organisations also produce better leaders, but also better able to make these connections with health, with education, with housing. We have housing associations in our membership as well, so that direct links between the housing provider and ourselves and advice. It's not a full answer, but it's something we can talk all day about. But it's the start of a process. So I hope it helps give you some sense of it.
And I think as ever, that kind of, I think we use the word collaboration a lot and not necessarily always doing very much about it. And I think there are great attempts to try and share what's working. So the Network for Justice is something we've set up. I think it's got 600 members now, trying to kind of just share work for people working with kind of litigants in person, individuals in particular, trying to share that kind of what works. But I think partly, as ever, depressing, it comes back to that capacity to engage with it. Because I think often we'll come for a day like this is great, they're really important ideas, and then you go back on Monday and actually everyone's back to their full inbox and everything else. But I think it's that bit about thinking of advice in that wider capacity is really important, because I think you're right, certainly we see it in terms of the people coming to us for help. Quite often it's not necessarily a legal issue, and they shouldn't have even been sent to us in the first place, but because they've been kind of signposted from another organisation who doesn't know what to do with them, I think that's a real challenge. So I do think the mental health piece is key, and because there are very few other mental health services, I think it means in terms of certainly what we're doing on a regular basis, a lot of it isn't specific to legal advice. It's around everything else that's going on in that person's life, and we're not best placed to deal with it. And we have some connections, but exactly, it's quite patchy. And I know before when we've tried to think, well, would it be great if there's just one port of call where everyone goes first of all? But talking to, like Chile said, more the niche service providers, people who work with young people, for example, say how they want to access advice and how they'll access information is totally different to how someone else would. Or a woman who's suffering domestic violence, she'll need to have resources very specific to her. So it's a real challenge between, on one level, thinking surely we can be far more effective and efficient, but at the same time sometimes there's a real reason why niche services are needed in the way they're delivered. But Lindsay, do you have anything on the workforce bit that Julie mentioned?
We do have a. I've got a big cough as well. Yeah, we do have a workforce issue. Oh, sorry, Lindsay Paul from the Advice Services Alliance. It's an umbrella group, goes right across the independent advice sector. And we've been doing some work with London Legal Support Trust to look at a kind of demographic time bomb, really, for the advice sector, because a lot of people have got my kind of age profile. And that in previous times there had been quite a clear career route through the advice sector. Many people started training as a student or a young person, volunteering. They then got a job working as an advisor. They then became a caseworker, and then it went on into management. And that career route just is not available anymore. This funding is short term. It means that you can't give people long-term contracts. You can't give them full-time contracts. You offer training for people, but it often doesn't then lead to a job. We're training so many students through the pro bono clinics. I mean, it'd be lovely to see what happened to them afterwards, but so many students have passed through our hands, but we don't see them come into the workforce because we can't promise the sort of career that you need in order to be able to get a mortgage. We can't offer that in the same way that commercial law firms or other careers can. So we do have a problem. So ironically, we have got we've definitely got a funding issues out there, but we've also got a skills shortage. I've just tried to recruit. I've not been able to recruit, and I know others have had similar problems. There's just not the people out there to bring into the workforce. So these are very serious issues that we kind of need to grapple with. And I've got the microphone. I'll hang on to it. Just to come back to that question about why is it everything is so patchy. When I was doing a research course, somebody said to me, well, of course, there's only two places that you can look for evidence about things. And you think, oh, that's great, two places, good, I'll remember that. And then they said, and that's time and space. And I think if you want to understand what's happened to the advice sector and why we are where we are, you look back over time to see where our roots came from in, well, going back to after the end of the Second World War, with citizens' advice being set up, and then the 1960s with the law centres network coming in, and then the 1990s, which were a bit of a heyday really, where we had legal services funding, were able to develop. And then you look at space, and that's about what happens in different localities, and particularly how the local politics works. I mean, in London at the moment, the GLA excuse me, and the London funders are doing huge amounts of work to support the advice sector, but there are London boroughs who are pulling entire funding pots, and not just for advice sector, either for the voluntary sector generally. So that, and those things we don't have control over. There are some really interesting examples going on at the moment. I think Welsh Government, the work they're doing is really interesting. London funders, Manchester. I don't know if in other parts of the country they're in Scottish Government. So there are pockets of this practice, but it's a real issue about rolling it out when we're also dealing with, you know, increased need and capacity just constantly being, you know, threatened really by lack of funding, but also lack of skills. Oh, I think I've talked myself out now. Thank you.
I feel like you should break into song, Lindsay, since you got. One of the things I think also is quite interesting, there was an all-party parliamentary group on pro bono and public legal education in Pro Bono Week, and there Hogan Lovells were talking with LawWorks about Mind the Gap, I think it's called. So it's a piece of research that they're trying to do with MPs around the country. So they have solicitors who are being trained up to go into MP surgeries to view them, and actually to try and note how many times legal issues are coming up. And I think they're using that just to try and show actually how often MPs are seeing cases where routinely it's actually a legal issue that's coming up. So I think things like that to try and raise awareness of just how prolific legal issues are is really important. What's quite interesting at one of the ones I went to, there's an earlier APPG, they were mainly the MPs who were lawyers who'd attended. So they were saying routinely, yes, this comes up all the time. Another MP who was there who wasn't a lawyer said, I don't necessarily think there are legal issues coming up all the time. So sometimes just depending on kind of what people's experience have been to date will impact on how much they see legal issues as being something which we need to kind of really try and grapple with or not. So I think this piece of research will be really interesting. So if anyone has any links, please do spread the word.
Can I just mention one stat from the Mind the Gap research that Bex mentioned, which really shocked me, which was when Hogan Lovells conducted the first Mind the Gap research some years ago, I think they discovered that 88% of constituents, clients who are coming through to MP's surgeries had a legal issue, and the vast majority were not recognised as legal issue. That doesn't mean they didn't have a simple legal issue. No doubt they had many other issues, health issues, family issues, but at least part of the issues they faced were legal issues, and most of them were not recognised as such by MPs. Understandably, if you're not a lawyer and you're not trained to recognise legal issues, how could you? So that's interesting research that will be going on with, as Bex mentioned, MPs, is I think also then to see what tools and resources can be provided to MPs as well as others to help them recognise what the legal issues are. Otherwise, you can't signpost people to help.
Just a reminder that, and I keep saying this, that you mentioned not a lawyer, but again, 95% of the people providing advice are not lawyers. So it's people who recognise social welfare, legal issues, and can partly or fully deal with them. I keep saying that because otherwise most of the advice to talk about is not being mentioned. I'm going to have to keep mentioning it's not a dissing the work of lawyers, just saying let's keep in mind the vast majority of people are not lawyers in the advice sector, the bread and butter, and the community-based advice centres by and large don't have any lawyers but do amazing work around social welfare law. I'll let it in a second, James, but I just in terms of back to your question, an attempts by intelligent and joined up funders who either know or partially know the advice sector. So I think it's in the public domain, but at the moment the Community Justice Fund, which is 5 or 6 funders led by the Access to Justice Foundation, managed with the support of the umbrella organisations, actually, to bring in a lot of money when the pandemic first started for specialist legal advice. I think millions and millions of pounds. And we, because I'm working on it with them too, at the moment, are just about to submit, and maybe keep it in this room, I don't know if it's public or not, a bid to the lottery, so for 30 million over 5 years. So it's not that much money, really, it's 6 million a year, but it is, and it looks at specialist legal advice. But there's a bit of an argument going on between these four walls, between people like me, people like me saying you have to recognise, back to the journey thing, but that people don't just plonk themselves in specialist legal advice. They don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of I don't know the word ecosystem, but they're part of an ecosystem. And those organisations, so-called grass, whatever terminology you want to use, are fundamental to the journey, but also they're key for early intervention. I'm almost at legal intervention. Forget the word legal for a second. Early intervention, because part of the problem is, as we all know, is people come in this super crisis. I'm getting might be repossessed tomorrow morning. What can you do? What? So it's that. It's getting it, and those community. I won't call them problem notices. That's again overused, but that I think is so fundamental to focusing on the grassroots connection with specialist legal advice, and actually go more than that and say we can really nip a lot of this stuff in the bud, so people don't need to be in a court or a tribunal. And that brings us to the other public services point. It might be interesting to get a perspective from Joe from MOJ, because you've also been working closely with Community Justice Fund. Do you want to say a couple of words, if you don't mind?
Thank you. Thanks, Chile. What an interesting discussion. And yes, so I work for the Ministry of Justice. I'm Jo Otterburn, and I head legal support policy along with my job share partner. So we're very lucky to talk to a lot of people like Lindsay on a regular basis. Broadly, we fund a number of different things that you might have heard about today. And one of them is the grants, which Chile's just referred to. I think what we sort of are grappling with to some extent is we absolutely understand that this is an impossible operating environment in many ways, and everything that we've heard about fragmentation and the fact that you're sort of struggling, it's like running up a down escalator, just trying to meet the need that's out there, let alone have the time to innovate and collaborate and do all the good things that you know you want to do. Part of what we're trying to do, as Lord Bellamy referred to and Daniel referred to earlier, is make the case to Treasury, and we've been well supported by the sector in trying to do that. So more evidence, more data, more evaluation. Again, maybe it's one to kind of keep within this sort of remit, but we've been funding, albeit I recognise at a very low level, but we have been funding legal support grants since 2015. For the first time, this year, because of data that we've got, we're now able to say there's a 62% diversion rate from court. That means something to the Treasury. That is something that they can understand in terms of, okay, there's potentially a downstream benefit here. It shouldn't be about that, but I think that's something that our team tried to do, to translate the very real world impact that we know that you're striving for and having into something that we can grow. And that's coupled with some of the kind of complementary projects that we've been working on as well around digital, online signposting tools, health justice partnerships. I think it's trying to do this in a world in which we realise that the changes to legal aid, have bitten. I think Lord Bellamy is a really strong advocate, and as you will have heard earlier, I think in some ways slightly sees himself as almost outside of government on this. But I think he's very, he knows he really is seized of the issues here. So. And I think very much looking to the future as where's this all headed, what does it add up to, and what's the link between legal aid funding and what we fund here in the legal support space. But just to close on, I was interested, Chile, in what you're saying about the National Lottery bid, which I was broadly aware of. I think it's also important for government, for MOJ to recognise, we fund through a lot of different departments, so and that's fragmented as well. So we're also just trying to get a bit more of a sense of, hang on, what's DCMS funding, what's BEIS funding, what are we funding, and how does that add up? But also, where are the other funding streams that may indeed be more sustainable, and what's the role of the state in terms of facilitating and creating an environment where you can tap into those sorts of funding models and make it easier. So we've been talking to Natalie Byram and Claire Carter about shared data standards, for example. We recognise it's not helpful when you've got different funders asking you to collect loads of different types of data. So what can we do to ease that burden, at the same time as get that richness through that helps us to make the case?
Yeah, well, I think just picking up on Lindsay's point, and also question of what government could do to make things easier. So Lindsay, rightly said that there's a lot of funding decisions driven by local politics, and that's certainly the case. But also there's huge differences within commissioning practices as between different local authorities and regional and sub-regional funders. And by commissioning practices, I mean procurement and tendering and how that's done. And this is a kind of contested space within government, in that there's been new legislation around procurement post-Brexit about how government procures services. And so I wonder what the scope now is for opening up a conversation with government on a kind of like, about 10 years ago, you might remember we had the discussions around the voluntary sector compact relationship between the government and the sector, and that included some kind of best principles around commissioning. And I wonder if there's something about revisiting some best practice principles around commissioning, because it can be done in very different ways, from ways which are incredibly complicated and incredibly time consuming, with suppliers having to supply the same information again and again and again and again and again when it's already held within the systems, to processes that are more proportionate and appropriate. But yeah, that's just something I wanted to throw in.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate I've already shared about CLOC, but just responding to Elizabeth's question, I mean, CLOC was very much envisaged as a collaborative hub, and the fact that we didn't apply for external funding meant that we weren't competing with anybody and we could signpost to wherever. So just going back to Chili's point about a sort of action or whatever, if anybody does want to sign up to CLOC, it's completely free. You just go on and put get involved, and then if somebody comes to us, we can signpost. Now, because of the digital, we can signpost wherever, and I think it's really important to think about the person's complex needs, because there's so many issues that person is facing. But in terms of tracking it in relation to the Ministry of Justice policy, is that we can then identify where the needs are, and what we need, you go back to Daniel's point about signposting to signposting, is that we need resources for those professional organisations that do have the expertise to take up the tasks that are required. And it might not be a significant, I mean, our statistics show that 70% can probably get through either not going to court at all or going to court with a legal companion, but there's 30% of people that really, really do need legal representation. And I think collectively we can do that. And I think since we've developed working with the local authority as well, so whether it's universities, so CLOC has different hubs in different areas through universities, but when they tie up with the local authority as well, and the Citizens Advice Bureau, and whichever law centre or advice centre, that creates a map really for that litigant in person to go through. So I think the reflections are that there are solutions that are discussed, but can we actually embed them so that those who are providing the legal advice and the legal representation are resourced to do so?
Thanks, Jane. I think it's literally kind of 1 minute till the next session. So thank you all so much. Name and shame the other 40 who didn't appear. But to those of you who did, thank you very much for sharing all your information with us today, and hope you enjoyed the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.